The earliest RPG game to date is Dungeons & Dragons, which was developed in 1974, which was a board and dice format. After the success of board and dice games, RPGs moved and developed online. This was the birth of text-based RPGs. They had simple options and a book-like format for players to progress the story.
For me, it started as a child, so playing Dungeons and Dragons, Hero Quest, the possibility that I can, even as a child, write my own, play my own story, was quite empowering as a young person, so it made me want to go out and do things my way, so, it gives you a bit of confidence, in the greater world. RPGs sell really well, especially in Lincoln, it being a uni town. Originally, RPGs were exclusively played by uni students in the 70s, early 80s. People coming to university, wanting to socialise. Role-play games are the best way of getting a group of people together, hanging out and playing an adventure.
For me, the RPG genre is, well, it's about expressing stuff you can't really do in every day-to-day, It's about exploring the depth of fantasy and just about whatever you can do. It introduced me to the RPG genre was probably, I'm going to say Fallout, probably. It was the first game I played, but at the same time I played things like Oblivion, played a bit of Mass Effect and a few other similar games.
People come in all the time. Thing about having a gaming store as a central hub is that people live different lifestyles, and as long as I've got somewhere for them to come that fits in around that, they turn up at all times.
The biggest key developments in the history of role-playing games are surely in 1974, the first release of Dungeons & Dragons, the first commercial role-playing games. Then in the early 80s we have the first digital role-playing game with Ultima, and in the mid-80s we also have the Japanese role-playing games with Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, which essentially kind of set the two paths between Western role-playing games and Japanese role-playing games. Then I would say another key development is with the online turn of role-playing games around the mid-90s with Ultima Online, and then in 2004 with World of Warcraft. Okay, it's difficult to say what makes an RPG because in a traditional sense an RPG is a game where the player can improvise and invent new stories and decide what the character, what his main character is going to do in a very free way, which of course is not possible in video games. So what we usually mean with role-playing games when we refer to video games in particular, it's usually a specific kind of game design strategy where the player can develop his own skills and improve the main character and guide the character through a narrative which is usually very long and developed. My main suggestion for anyone who wants to kind of start playing with role-playing games is probably Skyrim. It's a relatively recent role-playing game. It's accessible. It's actually just about to be remastered for modern consoles. It mixes traditional elements of fantasy role-playing games with more modern touches, and it has a good narrative. It's a very deep game, so it's a good game to play.
The main change is acceptability of role-play games. They've always been there in the background, but with fantasy movies becoming more popular, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, in the early 2000s they came back a lot more popular, and in the past 4 years they've become even more popular with World of Warcraft as well. People just playing by association, really, of their own personal hobbies. Any change is good change, and with the acceptance of role-play games and fantasy and being a geek, it just means that there's a bigger player pool, so there's more people to play, which stimulates the growth of the role-play hobby.
The decline of RPGs occurred during the mid-1990s. The advancements in technology and CD-ROMs made it difficult for the developers to keep up and set new standards and expectations with customers and distributors. They became harder to produce and became less frequent. Sequels were developed and released within 3 years of each other, which was nowhere near quick enough for the growing culture of gaming. As a result, first-person shooter games and real-time strategy became more popular and easier to produce and distribute. CRPG developers forced the RPG genre with new and improved game mechanics, like smaller party sizes, faster combat, and a more cinematic atmosphere than a novelistic one. In the late 1990s, more themed-focused RPGs were being released, like the Gothic Diablo series, which had the ability to connect to the internet during its infancy.
Well, role-playing games have been very influential for the skill-based system. So it is essentially a system where the main character develops his own experience and skills by playing through the game. And this was a feature of the traditional pen and paper role-playing games, and it's been translated into the digital form in role-playing video games. To the point that actually the skill-based system is now very popular in video games that are not necessarily role-playing games. So it's been a very influential game design technique. Another very important element of role-playing games is the narrative aspect. Role-playing games usually have a very strong focus on a good narrative, and this has been very influential for video games in general. So even in games that are not necessarily role-playing games, now we sometimes see a role-play, an RPG kind of narrative.
From 2000s onwards, CRPGs have increased and become more accessible on multiple platforms. RPG franchises like Mass Effect, Dragon Age, and Fable owe a lot to CRPG games. And pen and paper RPGs have influenced and adapted over the years, and they are still played and bought to this day by loyal customers.
That is a difficult one. In terms of preference, Dungeons and Dragons, sort of pen and paper version, is one of the best games I've ever played. But at the same time, I'm not going to say I haven't played a ridiculous amount of time on Skyrim or Fallout, or any other related games of RPGs. So it's difficult, but probably pen and paper.
Well, I started playing RPGs before playing video games. So D&D, Vampire, Cthulhu, the classic role-playing, pen and paper role-playing games have been very influential for me. Later on, I discovered role-playing video games, mostly through the Japanese role-playing games. So Squaresoft games such as Chrono Trigger or Final Fantasy have been quite inspiring for me. So for me, essentially it means a nice experience, a very engaging experience, one where you engage with an interesting narrative.
I've played both. Big fan of computer games, but there's nothing more satisfying than gathering up with a group of your friends, sitting down for an evening, playing a role-play game together.